All right, we're about ready to land this plane. Actually, we're about ready to take off this plane. So welcome aboard. Some of us are going to leave from Moncton. Others of us are going to leave from Newark. But we're going to spend probably about 7 or 8 hours, or 10 or 11 hours on the plane before we arrive. And when we arrive, we're going to arrive in Tel Aviv. So the blue there is the Mediterranean Sea, and Tel Aviv is the city that's pictured, or the city that's located there. You'll notice, just take a look at that map. You'll notice that Tel Aviv is just a little to the north and west of Jerusalem, and a little to the south and west of the Sea of Galilee. So just keep that in mind. This is a picture of Tel Aviv. It's a modern city of almost 500,000. It was not a biblical city. There was an early settlement there, Canaanite settlement there, but no biblical significance to Tel Aviv. It was founded in 1909. But not far from there is the city of Joppa, or as it's called now, Jaffa. Anybody remember what happened in Joppa? Well, lots of things. This is the city from which Jonah took ship to head to Tarshish as he ran away. This is the city to which Peter went and stayed at the home of Simon the tanner. And he went from here to meet with Cornelius. This is where this is where Peter had his vision, rather, of the sheet descending. So not far from there. We won't take the time to go. It's not a whole lot to see, but we're very close to Joppa. We're going to head from Tel Aviv up the coast, and we're actually probably going to go on a route that will run very close to the route that Peter and his entourage took to get up to Cornelius's, because Cornelius was up in Caesarea Maritima. That was the capital for the Romans, and so that's where Peter would have gone. You'll notice from the picture on the right, your left, your right, my left, that it looks like a harbor. And that's exactly what it is. There was no harbor there, at least not one that could be used. But our good friend Herod the Great decided that he would build a harbor where there had not been a harbor. And utilizing the latest technology in concrete that hardens underwater, uses volcanic ash, Herod the Great built an artificial harbor here, turning Caesarea Maritima into the capital for the Romans of this entire area. Much of the harbor is gone now, but you can see there's still a little bit there. The Romans later built an aqueduct. This aqueduct runs almost 10 miles up to the north and east toward Mount Carmel, bringing water through lead pipes and channels into Caesarea. And the theater that you see there, it's been reconstructed. But just at the floor of that theater, archaeologists early on discovered the first reference to Pontius Pilate outside the Bible. It was an inscription that was found on the ground, because this was where the Romans had their capital. He only came to Jerusalem as he had to. We're going to continue north up to Mount Carmel. Now, I'm not sure how clearly you can see this from where you're sitting, but you can see Caesarea down here, bottom left. We're going to head up either to or the road to the right. But you can see at Zichron Yaakov, the road branches off to the right. This is what's known as the Wadi Iron, the Iron Pass. And the ancient way of the sea, the Via Maris, used way before biblical times. This was the main travel route, and it came up the coast and it turned inland, passed through the Nahal Iron, and went by the city of Megiddo. We're going to come back to Megiddo, but we're going to take that route. I'm almost certain we are. We're going to end up at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is formed by a high ridge that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea. This is why we needed to turn inland. It is because it's this ridge that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea, it catches a lot of moisture from the prevailing winds. And this is why Mount Carmel is famous for its vegetation. It's a beautiful spot. But not only is its height and fertility significant and attractive, anytime you have something that's high and fertile, the ancients would associate it with the gods. And so the Egyptians referred to Mount Carmel as the Holy Headlands. Anytime you have a high elevation, people are going to worship on top of that elevation. That's just a feature of the ancient world. And it was no different for the Canaanites and Mount Carmel. Guess which god was worshipped on Mount Carmel? Baal. And so where does Elijah have his smackdown with the prophets of Baal? Mount Carmel. He gives them home field advantage. You can read about this in 1 Kings 18. The Arabic term for this is mukhracha, which means fire or sacrifice, reminiscent of the fire that fell in response to Elijah's prayers. Now we're going to turn back around and come down to Megiddo. Megiddo is one of the most fascinating cities that we're going to see, and I hope we have time to walk through it. One writer calls this the royal box in one of the great theaters of history. Why? Well, it's right at the junction of where the Wadi Iron meets the Jezreel Valley. So you're going to come through a narrow pass, and it's going to open up into this broad, expansive plain where battles have been fought since before biblical times. Just to your left is Megiddo, sitting up and overlooking this vast plain. This is a spot where people have built cities. In fact, there's 20 cities built on top of one another. Now, this is a feature that we're going to see from time to time in our trip. It's called a tell, T-E-L or T-E-double-L, spelled both ways. A tell is an artificial hill composed of layers of civilizations. Here's what happens. You decide you're going to build a city at a particular place, either because it's secure or because it has water or for some other reason, maybe combination of reasons. So you build your city on that place. Your city lasts for a couple of hundred years. Somebody takes you over, burns your city. Another group comes in. Where are they going to build their city? Well, the same conditions exist. They'll build it on top of yours. So they'll raise, level whatever was there and build on top of that. This happens 20 times in Megiddo. The other thing I want you to notice here is the big score that goes down this side. What archaeologists have to do is, in order to discover what's the earliest, which would be the lowest, they have to cut down through the other layers. So if you want to get the bottom layer of the piece of cake, you got to eat all the layers on the top. It's harder doing the archaeological work, but the same principle applies. So on the very bottom, we'll find things like a huge altar. It's probably about as big as this section of the platform. Stone raised up about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And this was an altar at which the Canaanites worshipped, probably Baal. May have been animal sacrifices. There were animal bones that were found among the remains. This is a very strategic location, fought over many times. Pharaoh Thutmose III said, capturing Megiddo is as good as capturing 1,000 cities. Joshua defeated the king here, although they didn't take the town. Deborah defeated the Canaanites here. Solomon fortified this city. The king Josiah was mortally wounded here when he came up to intercept the Egyptian army that was on its way to fight a battle further north. And in 1918, as a part of the First World War, there was the Battle of Megiddo. It was a turning point in the war. The Allies won, British, Indian, Australia, New Zealand troops against the Turks. And it was this battle that helped the Allies conquer Palestine. The conquering British general, Allenby, was given the title Lord of Megiddo. This is why you can understand why when the author of Revelation talks about this last great battle, he puts it where? Har-Megiddon. Har is the term for mountain. Megiddon references Megiddo. So the references to this plain, and many people believe there'll be a literal battle that takes place on this plain. We're going to continue inland to Tiberias. Tiberias is marked by the little red dot there, just on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. But on the way, we're going to cross what's known as the Shephelah. This is a type of land formation that looks like the picture there. I've given you a cross-section of Israel. You can see on the one side is the Mediterranean coast, and then moving inland, you have the coastal plain, and then just the lowlands there where it transitions between the light tan and the darker tan would be the Shephelah. Jerusalem and the other cities are on the central highlands, and then it'll drop down into the Rift Valley. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But we're right in there in the light tan, just as it's becoming the darker. Our destination is Tiberias. Tiberias plays almost no role in the Bible. It's referenced a couple of times. It was only founded in AD 20, so it was a brand new city by the time Jesus was there. Maybe Jesus' father worked there. He lived not far away. But this is the city to which the rabbis went when they were kicked out of Jerusalem after the Second Jewish Revolt. The Sea of Galilee is sometimes known as the Sea of Kinneret. Kinneret is a word that means harp, and so I've just given you a picture of a harp from a coin. Can you see where the name comes from? It's harp-shaped, sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias. It's fresh water. It's not salt water, so it's not really a sea. It's a big lake, 21 kilometers north to south, 12 kilometers wide. The depth is probably 130, 140 feet at its deepest. It's fed and drained by the Jordan River. So the Jordan, see where it says Hadnes up at the top? That's where it comes in, and where it says Afakim or Digyana Aleph, that's where it comes out. But that's that Rift Valley. The Rift Valley starts up in Syria or in Turkey, goes all the way down into Africa. Some of you may have heard of the Rift Valley Academy, a very famous school that is in Kenya. It's all part of this deep fissure in the ground, which creates the deepest spot in the ground, in the Dead Sea. But the Sea of Galilee itself, the surface of the Sea of Galilee, the surface is 210 meters below sea level. The surface. So you're deep, deep, deep in that cleft in the ground. Sea of Galilee is famous for its storms. I've been there in the morning, and it's as calm as glass. The day heats up, and you can see whitecaps on the sea. You can understand what happens when the disciples are out in their boat thinking they've got a smooth sail across, and all of a sudden a storm comes up. You see these high hills all surrounding it, and the depth of it, and the temperature, and that constitutes these storms. And so those pictures are two pictures that you'll probably see. Our destination at the Sea of Galilee is, first of all, going to be the Mount of Beatitudes. This is a modern church that was built in the 1930s. I think it was built by Mussolini, if I'm not mistaken. He built a bunch of churches. The original church was a little bit further away. But this one was built from the portico. You can see pretty much where most of Jesus' ministry occurred. We're going to go to a place called Tavga. Tavga has two churches. It used to have three. It's two churches. One of them is the Church of Multiplication. The second is the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter. But listen to these words from a woman who was a pilgrim, Christian pilgrim, to this area in the 4th century A.D. Remember I said that after Constantine's conversion, pilgrimage begins. And one of these pilgrims, her name was Egeria. Here's what she says about this region. Not far away from Capernaum are some steps where the Lord stood. And in the same place by the sea is a grassy field with plenty of hay and many palm trees. By them are 7 springs, each flowing strongly. That's where the name Tavga comes from. And this is the field where the Lord fed the people with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. In fact, the stone on which the Lord placed the bread has now been made into an altar. Past the walls of this church goes the public highway on which the Apostle Matthew had his place of custom. Near there on a mountain is the cave to which the Savior climbed and spoke the Beatitudes. So this is a spot where tradition identifies the feeding of the 5,000, the teaching of the Beatitudes, the call of Peter after his denial. This is the point where Jesus met him, and that's what this church is meant to represent. This is, again, a modern church, but you can actually see the walls of the 4th century church from there. And the stone that's in front of the table may be the one that Egeria is referring to, where Jesus provides the breakfast for his disciples. Do we know that that's exactly the spot? No. But there's a long tradition of associating these spots by the Byzantines with the events. From here, we head not far away at all to Capernaum. Capernaum is the capital for Jesus' ministry. It's the town that he chose as his headquarters. It wasn't where he was born or grew up, but that's where he chose to live. It's where he cured the paralytic. It's where he called Matthew. It's where Peter's house was, and he healed Peter's mother-in-law. This picture gives you a good sense of the size of the territory that we'll be visiting. We'll walk in through the road that's this direction. We'll walk in, and we're going to head to that corner there, which is the synagogue. The other building with the funny-looking shape is the modern church built over what was Peter's house. And that likely is where Peter's house was. You're going to see this wall and the interior of this synagogue. There's actually two synagogues that are here. There's the foundation stone of the earlier one that would have been there in Jesus' day, and then there are the walls of a second one that was built on the same spot, but probably several hundred years after Jesus. The one down at the very bottom, and it'd be difficult to see it from here, but when you get home and look at these slides on Facebook, down at the bottom, it's actually black basalt. Black basalt is the stone that you're going to see a lot in the Galilee region. It's a volcanic stone. It's very hard. And this was a volcanic area, so there's lots of this basalt around. And that's what the earlier synagogue was made of. The later synagogue is limestone, and you're going to see lots of limestone. Israel is famous for its really high-quality limestone. And you can see it there in the synagogue. This is an imaginative rendering of what that synagogue looked like. And again, there's another 3D view that you can look at. Just adjacent, you saw how close it was. Just adjacent to the synagogue is where Peter's house was. We're pretty confident it was Peter's house. If you turn to page 89 in the BAR 200, just turn to page 89. You'll see a picture of it. While you're turning, in the first century, this was used as a home and then a house church. And archaeologists contend that it was a house church based on the one room being plastered with what they call religious graffiti. So writing or carving into the plaster on the wall some kind of religious symbol. It might have been a shepherd. It might have been a fish. There's all kinds of this, it's called graffiti, but it's a good thing because it helps us to know, okay, this was a place that was being used for sacred purposes. And you're going to see that in this house. So the first century. By the 4th century, Egeria, remember the same pilgrim, she tells us that the house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church with its original walls still standing. An octagonal church, remember the shape, was built in the Byzantine time around that room, and by the 6th century, it's now a big basilica, large rectangular building. This church was built in 1990. It looks like a spaceship. But you can see on the one picture there, it's some of the original walls. From here, we're heading to Bethsaida, which is about 2 kilometers from the sea now, but it was originally at the seashore. This is where Peter comes from. This is where Andrew comes from. It's where Philip comes from. It may be where Absalom's mother comes from. Absalom, the son of David. We continue north to Caesarea Philippi. This is the place where Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And this is where Peter makes his famous confession. "You are the Christ, Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "On this rock I'll build my church." This happens at Caesarea Philippi. The picture that's to the side of the map is actually what remains of a temple that had been built here in worship of the god Pan, one of the Greek gods. And those niches that you see in the rock there are where statues would have gone of this Greek god. Hope you're not getting car sick. We've got a little ways to go. We're going to hit 3 cities now, 3 little towns really. Cana, of course, that's where Jesus did his first miracle, the turning of the water into wine. It's where Nathanael's from. But the real highlight of this day probably will be Nazareth, the largest of the churches in all of the Middle East, is built in the town where Jesus grew up. It's built over earlier churches, one as early as the 4th century. It's really cool going in there and seeing. You can go right down and see some of the remains of these very early churches. Nazareth is a Christian town, by which I mean it's populated largely by Arab Christians. And you can understand why. People would want to live in the town where Jesus grew up. And there are some remains from the time of Jesus. This house, the foundations of the house that you can see there date to the time of Jesus, 1st century. And then we head to a place called Beit Shean. Beit Shean is an amazing city from a Roman point of view and a Byzantine point of view. But you see that high hill in the back? That's a tell. So it's another one of those places like we saw in Megiddo, which is actually a layer cake of civilizations. It's been continuously occupied through the Old Testament period for 5,000 years. So there's lots of layers there. I think 18 different cities. That hill is 240 feet tall. And again, because of water supply, trade routes, just the right place to build a city. It doesn't play a prominent role in the Old Testament. It's part of the tribe of Manasseh. But when the Philistines killed Saul and Jonathan, they took their bodies to the walls of Beit Shean. They took them to this spot. Our last spot for the day, on this particular day, day 4, is going to be Yardenit. Now, Yardenit is a Jewish kibbutz. And they have decided to make their money on Christian pilgrims. They're right on the Jordan River. It's one of the few places in the Jordan River where you can safely baptize. And so they've created a site of baptism. And so I'm hoping that we'll have opportunity. If you'd like to be baptized in the River Jordan, that we'll have that opportunity. You'll need to bring your bathing suit, but you'll be given a robe to go over the bathing suit. But it's a neat experience to see. Let's see if, Joel, are there questions? You have the microphone. Are there questions? So far, we've landed. We've seen Megiddo, Mount Carmel, Tiberias. We've spent the night there. The next day, we went out and we saw the sites around the Sea of Galilee. And now this is day 5 that brings us back to Yardenit, and we'll spend the night in Tiberias. So before we go to bed, any questions on these first few days? All right, we're going to get up early in the morning and head south, heading down into the Jericho region. On our way, I hope we get to go by this view that allows us to see a monastery. It was built just hanging off the cliffs in the Wadi Kelt. Wadi is a dry riverbed. When it's wet season, it flows. When it's not, it's just a ditch. This is an impressive ditch. And this is actually something that gives you a sense for when Jesus says that a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. You get a sense for where the thieves might have been hiding. The modern road's a little bit safer. We're going to get to ancient Jericho. This just gives you an artist's rendering of what things look like. But we're going to get to see what some people believe to be the walls that were left standing in Jericho, or at least walls that date back to that time period. The other picture is from the ancient site of Jerusalem, looking up to what's considered the Mount of Temptation, where Jesus goes right after he's baptized. From here, I think we may get to go up the Mount of Temptation. I'm not sure, but this is a view back down to Jericho from there. From here, we head down to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is fascinating. It's the Judean wilderness, and the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. On our way, we're going to go by this place called Qumran. Have you ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? The first of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves that you can see there. They were discovered in the mid-1900s by some Bedouin shepherd boys who were just poking around like boys do, and they discovered these scrolls and these jars. It is the most significant archaeological discovery ever because it allows us to have Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that predate our earliest manuscripts by 1,000 years. Significant discovery. We keep going down to the Dead Sea. That's not me floating, but it could be you. You can't sink. I hasten to say you can die, but that's only if you ingest this water. This water is heavily, heavily, heavily salinated, 10 times as chemical rich as the ocean, which is why you can't sink. It's a great experience. Kind of slimy. People go there for health purposes, smear themselves up with the Dead Sea mud. I won't suggest if you need to do that. That'll be up to you. But if you want to swim in the Dead Sea, and I'd encourage it, it's a once-in-a-lifetime trip, bring your swimsuit. And from there we head to Masada. Masada is a rock that rises up off the plains, as you can see, very close to the Dead Sea. It looks like a battleship. It's huge. You can see a picture of this on page 63 in your BAR manual. Herod the Great, have you heard of him before? He decided he liked the security and the view and built himself a palace here, hanging off the cliff. Now, the picture on the left is an artist's reconstruction. This picture over here is actually an aerial view of his 3-tiered palace, and you can get to all 3 tiers. But this bottom one just hangs out over the valley. But all kinds of amenities and luxuries and hot pools and all kinds of things. It's remarkable. After Herod died and the whole palace, all that fell to ruin, at the end of the 1st century, right when the Jews were revolting against the Romans and the Romans were attacking and they destroyed Jerusalem, a bunch of the zealots, the Jewish rebels, retreated to Masada and set up a kind of last-ditch stand on Mount Masada. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, relates those last days of those Jewish zealots just before the Romans, who had built siege camps, which you can't see from these pictures, but you'll be able to see from when we get up there. The Romans surround the mountain, they build a siege ramp up, and just before they break in, the 1,000 or so zealots on the mountain decide that they would rather commit suicide than fall into the hands of the Romans. By lots, they decide which of the 10 people who should remain, they should kill the others, and then the one who held the lot would kill all the others, the other 9, and kill himself. And when the Romans got there the next day, all the Jews were dead. Now, that's the way Josephus tells the story. Historians like to quibble, but it is a remarkable spot. Back up the Dead Sea to the Ein Gedi, which is the spring of the goat. This is where David encounters Saul. Remember when Saul goes into the cave to relieve himself and David cuts the corner of his robe? Somewhere in this vicinity. And then we finish up our day in the Elah Valley. Who knows what happened in the Elah Valley? This is where David kills Goliath. We'll stop and we'll give you the orientation of where the Philistines were and where the Israelites were and where the battle took place, and you can kind of see it from there. We'll overnight in Jerusalem, and the next morning we'll start out at the Mount of Olives. Now, this is a map of the Mount of Olives. You can see that there's the Temple Mount. Above the Temple Mount, another 300 feet. Jerusalem sits up pretty high, about 2,100 feet. Another 300 feet higher is the Mount of Olives. So it overlooks Jerusalem. And there's all kinds of significance attached to the Mount of Olives. This is the mount from which Jesus ascends. And there's that church again, the Church of the Ascension. This is the place where the Garden of Gethsemane is found. And that's what the Church of All Nations marks. In fact, we'll go to the Garden of Gethsemane. These trees date back to maybe the 12th century. They're not original to Jesus. Some say they are, but the Romans cut down all the trees when they besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD. So I don't think these are original, but they're old and very impressive. This is a beautiful spot, very moving. From this spot, Jesus could look across the Kidron Valley and see the temple. He could see the Golden Gate. The prophet Zechariah says that when the Messiah comes, he goes through that Golden Gate and claims what's his own. Behind him is the Judean wilderness, and you've just seen it. You could get lost there and nobody would ever find you. So impressive to me that instead of running, instead of claiming what would be his, but in God's timing, Jesus lets himself be arrested and goes to the cross. You get that sense from the Garden of Gethsemane. Also on the Mount of Olives are other churches. Dominus levit marks the traditional spot of where Jesus wept. The Church of Pater Noster, the Our Father, it has the Lord's Prayer written in a bunch of different languages. And then we get to Jerusalem. This is an unforgettable experience. There's a map, we'll come back to that. There's Jerusalem from the air, and you can see the old city and the walls built in the 15th century, 16th century by Suleiman the Magnificent. You can see the Dome of the Rock in that central location. There's an incredible 3D trip through Jerusalem. I don't have the time, I don't have the technology to show it to you because I'm not on wireless, my apologies. But you can look at this on your own, I'll send it to you. If you're on the Facebook page for the trip, it'll be there. So you just look through the days. This is Jerusalem in its earliest days. It was originally a Jebusite city, so not Israelite. David captures it, and by capturing it, he creates his own capital city. It hadn't belonged to any of the tribes, but he captures it, gives him legitimacy. It's kind of centrally located. His city is that little tooth that comes down where it says City of David. The Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, is where the temple is built. The city will expand in the Old Testament period out to the farthest dotted line. In the New Testament period, it looks something like this. You can see the temple, renovated by Herod. You can see David's city, and you can see the extent of the walls there. These would be different walls than the ones that Suleiman built. These would be the walls that were built by the Maccabees. Okay, back to the aerial view. We're going to be going to the pools of Bethesda. Now, we're going to get to see somebody has created a scale replica of the city of Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. And so you can kind of get a sense for what the city looked like to scale. This is the picture of the pools of Bethesda. What happens here? What happens at the pools of Bethesda? John 5. Yep, the lame man that Jesus identifies. He wants Jesus' help to get him into the water when the waters are troubled. And Jesus heals him. Pools of Bethesda. This is where that church of St. Anne is located, the one I told you that has the great acoustics. Now, I included the picture there next to the picture of the scale model to show you the kind of thing you're going to be seeing. It's hard to picture it. Again, this is an American pickers moment. We're going to have to kind of clarify in our minds what we're actually seeing, but that's the spot. You've heard me talk about the old city of Jerusalem. Again, that's delineated by the walls that Suleiman built. There are 4 quarters of the old city. There's the Muslim quarter. This is where the Haram, es-Sharif, the Temple Mount, we call it. They call it the noble sanctuary. That's where that's located. There's the Jewish quarter. This is where the Jews, when they came in 1967 and conquered the whole city, they devastated what was in there and rebuilt it. It's the prettiest part of the old city. But we'll actually see remnants here of the wall that Hezekiah built to protect his city. And we'll see remnants of the street that the Roman emperor built in Aelia Capitolina. That's in the Jewish quarter. And then in the upper quadrant is the Christian quarter. This is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. And then there's the Armenian quarter. How do the Armenians get a quarter of Jerusalem? Armenia was the first country to declare itself a Christian country. And by virtue of that honor, they have a quarter of this old city. I mentioned that model. Here is the model of Herod's temple. It's quite remarkable, even in the scale model. But the only part that's remaining now is the western wall. You sometimes call it the Wailing Wall, but western wall is the more politically correct way to refer to it. What is it? Is it a part of the temple? No. What it is the last remaining structure for the retaining wall of the temple. It's all that's left. Remember I told you that Herod built that platform, it was 27 football fields? This is the last section of it. to which the Jews are given access. It's the holiest spot in Jerusalem. We're going to go there. You're going to have a chance to pray. And when you do, you'll see the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, and they'll be praying like this. There'll be deep emotion associated with it. You'll see in the wall, there are little crevices, and you'll see all kinds of pieces of paper stuffed. The people write their prayers, and they stick it in the crevices in the rock. And eventually, the caretakers come, and they take those pieces, and they bury them because they have the name of God in them, so they can't be burnt. This is the most sacred spot. Separated women and men. And men, you're going to have your head covered. So I have my yarmulke or my kippah. You could just wear a baseball cap, but men, you have to have your head covered when you get to this spot. It's that holy. This is also a holy spot for the Muslims. This is the Haram es-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. You can see the Dome of the Rock there, built on the spot where the Jews had their temple. Built in an octagonal shape with a dome. Think propaganda. The Muslims take over the territory. They build on the holiest spot in Jerusalem something that resembles a church as a way of saying, we're better than you are. And it's magnificent. This gold dome was refinished, I think, as the most recent treatment was 1993. Yes, 8.2 million. 176 pounds of gold paid for by the King of Jordan. But it was built in 691. By a Muslim ruler. It's not a mosque. It's the third holiest shrine among the Muslims. And as Pastor Joel mentioned, it's the spot where the Muslims believe that Muhammad left on his night journey to go and receive the Quran from the angel Gabriel. And if you look inside your BAR 200, you'll see a picture of the inside. We won't be able to go in. We're not allowed to go in anymore as Christians. But the picture will show you, and you'll see the stone in the middle, and from that stone, they say he ascended. Also on this spot is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, so that would be this gray dome down here toward the bottom. This is the mosque where the Muslims come, and this is a holy spot for them because of the spot from which Muhammad left. That's where Solomon's colonnade would have been. Like in the temple when the early Christians gathered together in the book of Acts, and it talks about Solomon's colonnade, that's where it would have been, right where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. As a part of the old city of Jerusalem, we're going to be probably traveling the Via Dolorosa, which is the traditional site. It's not the actual site, but it's the traditional site where Jesus passed on his way to the cross. We'll go past the Ecce Homo arch, the Via Dolorosa. That's not probably the spot where Pilate tried him. It would more likely have been in Pilate's palace in the Jewish quarter. But we do know that the buildings just to the one side is where the fortress of Antonia was, where Paul was arrested when he went into the temple, and the riot began, and the Romans came and they pulled him in for safety, brought him into the fortress. That's right there at that spot. We'll get into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is one of the most sacred sites, maybe the most sacred site in all of Christianity, but it isn't going to feel that way. You're going to get in there and you're going to say, this feels weird. There are 6 or 7 different Christian groups that operate in here. There's an agreement that they came to because these groups were fighting so much that they finally settled an agreement in the 19th century that they live by. There was a ladder that was leaning against one wall for, I think, 200 years because nobody could agree to take it down. It just doesn't feel right. But it is probably the traditional site where Jesus was crucified and buried. The most sacred spot of all is this, what's considered the tomb of Christ. And again, it has a lot of legitimacy to the place, but it won't have the feel. And so we'll include the garden tomb, which isn't the place, but is the feel. It's a garden. Somebody thought this looked like a skull. But this is a first or second century tomb that is very similar to the one Jesus would have been in. So we'll include this as well. Our trip finishes in Bethlehem. which has been a Christian city, although the Christian population has declined precipitously. It's now probably below 10%. It had been up as high as 50%. But here's where we're going to come to the Church of the Nativity, the traditional site where Jesus was born. You'll notice the low door. It dates to the 16th century. It wasn't originally that small. It was built that small for security reasons. But the guides like to talk about how only the humble can come to Christ at this spot where he was born as a baby. Most of the churches were destroyed by the Muslims. The Persians, who when they came through, spared this one, I think it was in the 8th century, because the artist that had painted the mural on the wall of the wise men painted them wearing Persian clothes. So when the Persians came in and were set to destroy the church, they saw themselves up on the wall and left the church standing. So it's really one of the oldest churches, maybe the oldest church standing in Israel, all because of an artist. And then we'll head out to the shepherd's fields, to this spot where they first heard.